Okay, folks, I'm going to use this one as a summary to kind of tie up some loose ends on the other seven of these things I've made. Okay, I realize how bad they are. Right before I publish them, I listen to them one more time, and I can hear the mispronunciations and the mistakes and the misreadings. But I'm making these things because, frankly, the truth is just not out there. It's just not available. And I wouldn't be going to all the trouble if I didn't think this was important. I rely always on primary source material. I don't make up anything. The only feedback I've had about my sources was this one gentleman who said there were hearings at Pillow the night of the 14th before the executions and the torture began. There may well have been. Of course, there's no evidence that it was official. In fact, I can almost guarantee you there were no official hearings held that night. Forrest retired from the battlefield early. He was badly wounded, and he turned over command to Chalmers. Chalmers was trying to clear the battlefield as quickly as possible because they came for supplies. And all the supplies, the food, the leather goods, the ammunition, and the weapons that he was trying to get out of there were more important to him than anything else. So he was trying to get them to the rear. Because we know for a fact that Chalmers placed a stronger guard on the prisoners. There's a record of it. Yet many prisoners did escape, including the young lieutenant that filed the official report. So clearly what happened, and there's no record of it, but you've got tons of supplies to move, and you've got a bunch of black guys and a bunch of Yankee prisoners standing around. Okay, you get them to move it under guard. I'm sure that's what happened. That's what the first party was. And they clearly had it cleared out by the next morning. The Confederate Army did not have time to hold any kind of a formal hearing that night. The prisoners would be executed, the ones that were on the death warrants, but that would be over the next several days. Forrest was out cold as soon as the battle was over. He went to his tent and passed out. Chalmers dealt with the wounded, establishing the camps and placing the guards and moving the supplies and taking care of the horses. And there was, if some of the men got together and started discussing among themselves what they were going to do with some of their enemies that they were particularly mad at, that might have raped their women or tortured their friend, and you want to call that a hearing, I suspect that may well have happened. Of course, there's no proof. I have looked at all of like the indexes for the magazines, North, South, Blue, Gray, Civil War Times, and over the years gone back and seen all, tried to read all the articles about Pillow and know of the existence. And I try to know of the existence of all of the primary source records, diaries and letters and interviews. If there's one out there, I'd love to see it, but I just don't think there is. So we're just going to have to say we don't know what happened that night. Some people ended up getting killed. The gunboats talk about the next morning, some of the Union soldiers burst from hiding under the bank, and when they were trying to get to the Union ships, the pickets on the bluff shot them down. That's something I didn't mention in the video. That's not illegal. When an enemy soldier is trying to get back to his own lines, you can shoot him dead, as horrifying as that may have been to the Navy. You know, like, I'm sorry. And the prisoners that were on the death warrant that were listed as taken POW did not make it into Confederate custody. They were killed. They were executed over the next few days. There is no doubt about that. And that's something I've noticed that the Union historians don't add, that the POWs that were taken were later killed. I don't think they want to really get into the whole death warrant thing. and that half of the command was under a death warrant or were civilians, and to which the Confederates had no obligation to take as prisoners. As far as the black spy, I called it Lee's black spy when clearly he was managed by Rosser and the cavalry. Well, Lee knew about him, and he also knew about, if it was two, he knew about the other one at Trevilian. I think it's the same one. I think that's part of the reason for Lee's anxiety just before Gettysburg. He knew he had spies in the headquarters, but a series of coincidences had deprived him of the men to whom they would communicate. Stringfellow had just been arrested. Conrad was out chasing around the country looking for Stuart. Mosby was separated too. I don't think Stuart realized just how blind he had left Lee. The other men, like Rosser, the men in his command who knew how to get in, the advanced scouts that knew how to get to the spies, that the spies would open up to, were not there. In that respect, Lee was blind for the one and only time of the war, but he wasn't in Virginia. Every battle in Virginia, he knew what was happening, even before he took command. The Battle of First Manassas is definitely on Rose-Greenhow. The second one is on the Confederate cavalry's sweep around McClellan and the advanced scout like Mosby, that also kept Lee informed after the Peninsula, when, like Mosby told Lee that they were transferring McClellan's troops up to join Pope in the Army of Virginia. And then, of course, you had Stringfellow and the Black Guy penetrating into the Union headquarters and stealing it. Okay, in the very next battle, you had the Lost Order. Mr. Joe Ryan says the Lost Order was a ruse de guerre. Well, I don't know, but Stuart had spies in the headquarters when the Lost Order was revealed to McClellan. And D.H. Hill said at the Battle of South Mountain that it was the orders contained in the Lost Order that saved his army. So I think there's the possibility it was a ruse de guerre, but that wasn't a victory, and that was in Maryland. Okay, in Fredericksburg, that was Conrad. Conrad and some of the local civilians were bringing the information to Lee. He was in there ahead of time and well entrenched. At Chancellorsville, you have the Confederate cavalry finding the edge of the Union 10th Corps and finding guides to get around there to it. So that information that led to Lee's superior intelligence in that position. So at Gettysburg, Lee is blind. Stringfellow's arrested, Mosby separated, Conrad's off looking for Stuart. The only other men that could penetrate to the rear and get the information that Lee wanted were with Stuart. Okay, as far as I can tell, after like Falling Waters all the way through the Overland campaign, Lee was never in the blind again. He knew exactly what was going to happen, hush cat. At Wilderness, he said he knew that Grant was going to Spotsylvania. I mean, there's no doubt he took immediate action. He knew what was going on in Grant's headquarters the whole time, when he wasn't blowing it up like at City Point. You don't hear about, nobody's ever put it together, the whole Confederate intelligence service, because that was the service that assassinated Lincoln. Okay, 100 people at least were as guilty as was Mary Surratt in being responsible for the maintenance of the secret line on which Booth was escaping. The story of that whole organization kind of had to go underground with that. I didn't really talk all that much about why I think they needed to go ahead and execute Stanton, that we have sufficient evidence. We don't know, which one of them, Johnson or Stanton, actually talked to Booth or how that went down. But he did commit murder, judicial murder of Mary Surratt and George Atzerodt. George Atzerodt was not convicted of anything. There was no evidence to support his execution. And Mary Surratt, yeah, she probably was an accessory, but so were 1,000 other people. And Stanton obstructed the court from sending the recommendation for leniency to Johnson. He had his men protecting Johnson from that kind of information. So he suppressed evidence. He was an expert at manipulating and forging documents. He spent 2 years working with that in California with forged documents. He was probably the one that actually sat there and re-sewed the booklets in Booth's diary. I don't think he'd want anybody else to handle it, and it took him a little time to do it. And that is tampering with evidence. In a capital case where a person is executed, the kind of judicial misconduct he did, suppressing the Atzerodt evidence and all the rest of it, is judicial murder. And you can put a noose around his neck and hang him for it. And then you have to assume, if he would commit murder to the extent he did, then he's hiding something about his involvement in the murder of Lincoln. So I think you just hang him for the judicial murder of Mary Surratt and Atzerodt. And then you close the case on Lincoln. That's the reason I said, it'd be hard to hang Johnson. He didn't really directly tamper with evidence. And the calling card and the mention in the Atzerodt diary and the way he benefited and caved into Stanton is enough circumstantial evidence, I think, to realistically say that he's guilty too. But I don't know. A good lawyer might, it is circumstantial, a good lawyer might talk him out of it. In Northern social superiority, which was, of course, sarcastic, I did not actually say that Stanton had a policy of exterminating the Indians. However, you see the same theme time after time in Minnesota, and then again in California, and then again in Arizona, that you cannot make treaties with these people, that they all need to be exterminated, and do it in such a way that it scares the other Indians. That's a policy. As soon as the authorization for the Union Pacific Railroad came through, clearly Stanton initiated an extermination policy. They said that in the days before Lincoln was killed, he was still working on a plan to move all the colored people, all the Indians, all the black people out of America. That was instituted when the war was underway as a war measure. It was the same thing that was instituted in the contraband policies and against white people of the South. Now, some people say you can't blame Lincoln from that. That was too far away. I'm sorry, but I can. Communications were pretty good. They were getting messages back and forth within a month. And too often, you just see the same thing happening time and time and time again. It's absolutely been controlled from Washington. And maybe Lincoln didn't order like the slaughter at Killdeer Mountain or Keysville, but he authorized a policy that promoted that kind of behavior. So it's on his hands, or on Stanton's hands. There is what one living Civil War historian, a person who can actually relate to the society of the people at the time, who had the oral tradition and could actually go question the participants when he was learning about the events. He has something that none of the current historians have, and when he's gone, that'll be the last of them. The book should have been closed on the Civil War in about 1970, because but after that, there were no more people that could actually relate to that time. And now we are putting a completely different set of values on these people and completely twisting what they were. My ancestors were good, decent Christian people. They were not motivated simply to abuse black people. They didn't know about racism at the time like we know it now. My great-grandmother loved her black friends. She thought that Martin Luther King was like Robert E. Lee. She didn't see any difference. And my black relatives didn't see any difference either. Dr. King was not anti-Confederate or anti-statue. He understood to some extent that the segregationists had appropriated a flag that did not mean what they thought it stood for racism. Dr. King knew it did not. Clearly, if you read his book on chapter 28 about Chicago, he said that he was homesick for the Southern bigots. I mean, his homeboy bigots were better than what he saw up there in Chicago. Well, basically, that is because segregation had been instituted longer in Chicago than it had been in Alabama and Georgia. And as bad as things are when he was coming up, it was the old ties, the old people who still had feelings of affection and kindness for each other. You just didn't see in the North. And this Lincoln worship lady, Goodwin, who wants to tie the civil rights movement to the holiness of Abraham Lincoln, has just become popular mainstream history. And it is a disservice to our children. It has nothing to do with the Civil War or Lee or any of that. It has to do with teaching children what to think instead of how to think. And it's very important that we defend the Confederacy, because the next thing you know, they're going to be changing the story of World War I and World War II. Once they start manipulating history, once it gets beyond living memory, it's just a dangerous can of worms to open, and that's exactly what they're going to do. And those of us who were lucky and fortunate enough to have some vestige of the old people will be gone soon and won't be able to say with as much confidence that the Lincoln worshipers are lying through their teeth. They did not invade the South to do the black peoples any favor, and they didn't do the black people any favors. They were much worse off. The time after the war became the Great Dying Time. That was the time, that they all said was so horrible that they'd been thrown out in the street like dogs. Where they'd starved, and the carpetbaggers and the unionists, the scallywags, abused them and forced them to stay on plantations to work. It wasn't the old Southern people. In fact, there were very strong ties between the old Southern people and their slaves. The idea of net noblesse oblige, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the obligation that comes with privilege, was very much a part of their Christianity and their reality. And I just really get sick and tired of people saying that somehow that they are criminals or traitors. That is ridiculous. Yeah, they like to fight. They fought a lot. This is Mr. Ed Barrett, the last legitimate Civil War historian. He's the only man alive today whose opinions and observations I would accept without question or reservation. Okay, this William Henry Greene, whose name I use for my membership with the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, was a direct descendant of Roger Greene, the first ordained minister in Jamestown. His family had been living in the Caribbean even before Jamestown was established. In other words, English people in the 1500s in the Caribbean had managed to marry into the Spanish nobility. They weren't so arrogant as to think they brought education or religion to the New World. Okay, they established William and Mary in the next generation. And like you have Greenville and Greensboro. They always believed in noblesse oblige, that they had an obligation to advance religion and education and the Bible, which they thought was the very most important thing in a classic education, even if it meant learning Greek and Latin to actually read it properly, which they believed. And that tradition continued on to my great grandmother, which I knew. Okay, these people had been picky about their rights for about as far back as you can trace in history. They didn't take invasion lightly, and they would fight viciously and savagely to protect their land. And why that the North couldn't see that is kind of beyond me. Okay, I've been doing some research on the gens de couleur libre, the free people of color of Louisiana, because Dr. Joyner talks about Carroll Jones, who contributed significantly in the logistic support in the Battle of Mansfield. And I also know that there was a free people of color named Oliver who paid for an entire Confederate company. I know the Metoyers went broke. I really don't have the information to put it together into a proper video yet. And for all you people out there that actually subscribed and the ones on the Confederate Cavalry Intelligence Service, thank you for putting up with these things. Dio Vindice. Except for slide number 1, I had a relative in all of the fights I listed as I've been giving this narration. I had a double great-grandfather that died at Kennesaw Mountain. So this is an interesting picture of the Yankees picking up their dead in front of the entrenchments. Well, my great-grandfather, double great-grandfather, was one of the Confederates lying on the other side of that fence.
We are a band of brothers and native to the soil, fighting for our liberty with treasure, blood, and toil. And when our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far.